Hi, welcome to the Pursuit of Truth. So I was just watching Sky News about the NHS and ambulances and people dying because of the way the NHS is being run at the moment. I guess the government will say it's all to do with COVID and to do with the rising prices and the war in Ukraine and all that kind of stuff, which may have some validity if you believe that the only way of living is the way that we're living at the moment. Which everyone, I don't know how many more examples we need to see that we need to stop living this way, putting ourselves in the slave way of doing things just for money, and when everything's been given to us freely, and that's only our predecessors that have put a price tag on it. Anyway, you can listen to many Pursuits of Truth about that. But it was just worrying, because imagine if your loved one or yourself gets ill and then you have to rely on an ambulance. This case it took 16 hours to get an ambulance. I don't know if it was a category 1 or 2 thing, but and he blames that's the reason why his wife passed away. I'll play it in a minute. And someone's claimed that 500 people every week are dying unnecessarily because of, I guess, the ambulances. Like in the Stoke hospital, they showed ambulances. I know that the media are just picking these particular points and they're trying to create a story because that's their job. And fear is part of it as well, because it makes people, talk about it, like I am, like the way they've done the statistics, that they're comparing now the flu. They're trying to talk about flu and COVID. They don't mention any COVID figures. No, they don't. Only I am probably the only person who's looking it up and seeing that 500 plus people are dying every single week. But on the media, they're not even showing it. They showed that 400 Russians died in the Ukraine war, but not 500 people in their own country where Sky News and BBC has done are dying every single week of COVID-19 still. But now they're talking about there's 500 people that are unnecessarily dying because of waiting, etc. What I was talking about was statistics, wasn't it? And the problem with the statistics is they're showing the flu. They're showing that now there's 3,000 people in the hospital because of the flu, although they don't mention the COVID-19. There's 7,000 because of COVID-19, a much bigger figure. But anyway, the 3,000 that they're mentioning, they're comparing that with last year's flu, and they're showing it was only like 50 people. But the problem is, of course, the COVID was around those days, and the people that more likely to have died from flu or been hospitalised by flu are those ones who probably got COVID instead. And so to try and make that comparison, because they want to show that figure as high, is they must know themselves that, wait a minute, you can't compare that. I'm not a statistician, but I know that that is a unfair comparison to make. What they should have done is picked pre-COVID, 2018, say, and then looked to when there was no COVID to see the flu admissions to hospital. And I bet they were higher. I don't believe that they were 50 back then. They were 50 back in 2021 because most people had COVID instead of pneumonia or flu. And so they're misrepresenting the truth. But most people won't think about that. They're just saying, 50, now 3,000. Oh, there's a flu epidemic. No, there isn't. It's the same. It's just that the people before in that year had COVID instead. Or maybe had both. And it depends how good they are at diagnosing things. Like, I'm worried about this scarlet fever. I think there is a new thing around that's similar to scarlet fever. I don't know whether the people that died of scarlet fever, they were actually tested or they just looked at them, because there is this other thing that's going around that looks very similar. It has the flushing, it has the red rash, has the dry skin, it has the tonsils, it has all these other things, but it doesn't come up as scarlet fever. And for two things to be around at the same time seems too coincidental. So I think there is a new thing that's going around that has some similarity, a lot of similarity to scarlet fever, but isn't it? Or isn't being detected, because it all depends how great their detection systems are, which I don't think they are that great. These days, if you go in, they never swab you, and they only swab you if they know, what it could be, because they can only compare that. Anyway, let me play this story to you, because it's very worrying that the time we're living in at the moment, like with money and all that kind of stuff. To be honest with you, when I go to sleep, it's very difficult for me to sleep, because all I think about is debt and money and how I'm going to pay the bills and all these things in the future, and where the caps run out and all that kind of stuff. and how, my house and all that kind of stuff. And it's a very worrying time financially to be thinking about these things. Part of why, I keep going on about that. Why are we living in this way? That's giving us all this mental anxiety and stress. And lots of people, I'm sure, are committing suicide because they're getting in this situation or losing their house or on the streets because we're choosing to put ourselves in this, in these shackles of money and this way of living that we don't really need to live like this. It isn't beneficial to humanity. Anyway, let me play you this because it's very worrying, and I just hope anyone listening that they don't get anyone who's sick or know anyone who's sick or with a medical condition, because it's very worrying to think that if you have to rely on the NHS at the moment, or ambulances, no matter where you are, that you may be stuck for hours waiting. And even when you do get into an ambulance, you may be queuing outside the ambulance or in the... I know I'm doing the media's job now of creating fear. But it just seems worrying that no one's really doing anything about it, as usual, because life is, well, they don't care, is it? Unless you're rich or wealthy, and then they throw parades for you.
Aisha, thank you. And for a full list of strikes taking place across the country, you can scan the QR code. Is it going to come up? There it is. It is there. You can scan that QR code for the full list of strikes. Right, more now on the NHS, and more than a dozen trusts and ambulance services have declared critical incidents over the festive period. The Royal College of Emergency Medicine claims that up to 500 people are dying each week as a result of delays and problems with urgent and emergency care. A Department of Health and Social Care spokesperson said, "We recognise the pressures the NHS is facing following the impact of the pandemic, and that is why we've backed the NHS and social care with up to £14.1 billion of additional funding over the next 2 years." The British Medical Association says that the government's political choices were leading to patients dying unnecessarily. Our chief North of England correspondent Greg Milam reports from Hull now, where he's been speaking to a man whose wife died after waiting more than 16 hours for an ambulance.
She was my best friend. She was my soulmate. She was very supportive. She was loving. She was in a wheelchair, yeah. She never once moaned about her illness.
It was barely a month ago that Teresa Simpson died. Her husband says the time it took for an ambulance to arrive when she fell ill at home is to blame.
16 hours and 45 minutes I had to wait, and he only came the second time because I rang him. I had to ring him back saying that my wife was lifeless. 100%, I believe that if they got to my wife within the 6 hours, say from 3 till 9 o'clock, my wife would still be here now. I'm 100% that she would still be here today because she would have got the help.
In a statement, Yorkshire Ambulance Service offered Mr. Simpson their sincere condolences. Our patient relations team, they said, has received correspondence from him raising concerns about our response to this incident. They will liaise directly with Mr. Simpson about specific details relating to this. Teresa died here, and Matthew praised the medical staff who tried to save her life. Health officials say as many as 500 people a week are dying across the country as a result of delays in emergency care. And they say these are not short-term issues caused by COVID or a bad flu season, but a long-standing problem that is blighting the NHS every winter. But NHS England disagrees.
We don't recognise those figures, and I think you need to be extremely careful when you look at the what are called excess mortality figures. If you look and make international comparisons, you'll find that many health systems, as they're coming out of the pandemic, are seeing higher levels of mortality than you would traditionally expect. So the same is the case in Germany, in Italy, in Spain. I think it probably is fair to say that certainly talking to frontline staff, talking to frontline chief executives, this does feel like it's the most significant degree of pressure that we face.
The ambulance delays, the gridlock at A&E, the staff shortages come as industrial unrest continues.
We cannot go on like this. We can't be sitting here next year saying, well, this is even tougher than last year. January is our toughest month. The idea that we can then take 2 days of nurses' strikes, 2 days of ambulance staff strike, on top of all of this, without there being major implications for patients, well, it's a fantasy. There will be more harm. There will be more risk.
And it's families up and down the country who'll be facing that.
We both knew she was on borrowed time because of her myotonic dystrophy, but no, I'm sorry to say, but she should never have been left like that and to be left to die the way she did.
Greg Milam, Sky News, Hull.
So with more than a dozen trusts and ambulance services declaring critical incidents over the festive period, and others saying they're struggling to cope with surging demand, how do the latest figures compare with previous winters? Sky's Becky Cottrell has been finding out.
We've heard multiple warnings in the last few days that the NHS is facing extreme pressure this winter and on multiple fronts. So what do the figures show? One measure of the health service performance is A&E waiting times, which have increased dramatically over the last 2 years. In November 2022, more than 37,000 people waited more than 12 hours in A&E before being admitted to a hospital department. That's 34 times higher than it was at the end of 2019. The latest figures show there's also been a sharp increase in the number of people having to wait over an hour for an ambulance. Look at the red line, that's 2022. On Christmas Day, the latest day for which we had data, more than 1 in 7 people waited more than an hour for an ambulance. That's almost 10 times higher than in 2021 and 17 times higher than in 2020. Demand for beds is also higher because there are more long-term patients than any of the 3 previous years. Take a look at the third graph over here. It shows over the past 4 years the number of beds taken up by people who've been in hospital for more than 3 weeks in the week leading up to Christmas. Last year it was almost 25% higher than it was in 2021 and 60% higher than it was in 2020. So why is demand so high? It's at least partly because of the pressure created by rising flu cases. Let's look at the flu admissions in the week leading up to Christmas in 2021. There were just 34 people in hospital with flu each day, and only 2 of them required critical care. Now let's look at the week leading up to Christmas in 2022. There were 3,746 patients each day in hospital with flu, with more than 260 of them in critical care beds. So we're seeing more than 100 times more people being hospitalised with flu and requiring critical care in the run-up to Christmas compared to the year before. And that's all happening as the health service faces a staffing crisis. As of September 2022, there were more than 133,000 job vacancies across the NHS, and around 11% of those vacancies are in nursing, with the Nurses Union saying poor wages and working conditions are why so many are leaving the sector. Now, the government says it's doing all it can to relieve the strains on the health service. But with multiple NHS trusts declaring critical incidents, a winter of industrial action, and the pressure of flu and COVID cases, it seems the NHS is in for a challenging start to the new year.
So you see there, they compared COVID years. I mean, surely they know that you can't compare the COVID years. And it's interesting that they obviously think that the 3,000 people in the hospital and the 267 or whatever it is in critical is a high number. Then why they didn't mention the 7,000 that have COVID-19 that have been issued in the hospital in the week before those figures? I think it was up to December 18th, I think, the ones I saw on the NHS website. Why? Because they want you to worry about flu, don't worry about COVID-19. But the thing is, what it's all about, the government, you heard, their statistician was saying about, you can't look at extra mobility figures. They want to put their head in the sand, same as Rishi Sunak and all those people in charge. They just want you to they don't want to do anything about it, probably because they don't have money to solve this problem. That's the problem. But people are going to die because of this. But as long as they make money, what's the problem? And I expect they're thinking that the people who are going to die probably are the ones who are not making any money anymore. So that's why they're not really worried. If it was the 30s, 20s to 40s that are dying of flu, then they probably would be concerned about it because that'd be their workforce. Then they wouldn't get their tax money. Then they wouldn't have their flush cars and their big houses and etc. But that's the problem with this system. This system's always going to create this greed and possession. And people are going to keep dying. This is just an incident. one incident happens at January that they talk about. These incidents are happening all around the world all the time. People dying unnecessarily because of the systematic way we all live, the way that we possess things that were freely given to us. I don't know, it seems like everyone gets these examples, but nothing ever changes. Are we that brainwashed that we can't, or it's just because we just don't have the power anymore, even though intrinsically everyone has equal power whenever they're born? It's just we give it away with these systems. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care, take it easy, God bless. Peace.